But the basic assumption on our side is, of course, that technology transcends everything. The distinction between what is local and what is global makes no sense anymore. Some of the platforms have no respect for national borders.
The voice you heard was that of Casper Klynge, the Danish technology ambassador and the world's first tech ambassador. And I'm Azeem Azhar. You're listening to a special edition of the Exponential View podcast that's brought to you jointly with Casper. For thousands of years, technology developments have significantly impacted politics. Take the immense improvements in shipping technology and navigation during the 16th and 17th centuries and the advantage this gave to European nations, or the development of the telegraph in the 19th century, which reduced the communication delay across a continent from 10 days to less than an hour. Although powerful, these technologies were really merely viewed as tools, not as political agents. Well, this has changed with the internet. Many companies now have revenues that exceed the GDP of many nations. The largest internet platform, Facebook, has nearly twice as many users as China has people. In some cases, these companies hold the reins over the digital public sphere. So what are the implications of these changes? We're going to tackle these issues and many more in one of my very favorite conversations of the year. So before we get to that conversation with Kasper, let me tell you about Exponential View. It's my way of explaining how the world is changing under the force of technology. The podcast, These Conversations with Some Brilliant Minds, is one avenue. The other is through my free newsletter, a wonder missive which lands in your inbox every Sunday. If you haven't subscribed, you can find it at www.exponentialview.co. Now, I also have to ask you to take a moment to share this podcast with your friends. Or if your podcast platform allows ratings, to spend 10 seconds to go off and give us a 5-star rating. It's the best way to ensure that other listeners find the podcast. For the next few weeks, the Exponential View podcast is sponsored by Spotify. Like many of you, I've been using it as my music platform of choice. So it's exciting that Spotify is also getting into the spoken word through its new podcast service. Just open the app and search for your favorite podcast, Exponential View. This is a unique podcast because in a sense, we're both hosting it.
Absolutely.
Because this will be on my podcast season and it will be on your podcast season.
That's right.
Yeah. So let's see how it works on this rainy day in London. And in fact, as we are talking over in Parliament, there is this multi-parliamentary committee asking questions of Facebook, which is quite fascinating. And I guess Facebook is part of your patch.
Absolutely. It's one of the partners that we're trying to have a closer relationship with and a closer dialogue with. So that's part of the mandate of a tech ambassador, not to be an ambassador to a country or to an international organization, but in fact to be towards the industry, to Facebook, Google, Tencent, Alibaba of this world.
It's so interesting because we've seen for years these slides go out on conferences, people presenting the world's biggest countries, and they put Facebook and Google and so on there, and they'd say, well, if Facebook was a country, it would be the third biggest in the world. And it was the second, and now it's the first. And so what's the gestation of the tech ambassador program? How did that emerge within, I guess, the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs?
Yeah, I guess we are as close to becoming sort of a startup inside government as you can be. This was an innovation process that was initiated a couple of years ago in the Foreign Ministry, where we put a number of younger colleagues into a house and we locked the door and we said, come out with a number of recommendations on how we bring diplomacy or the foreign ministry into the 21st century. And I think they came out with 30 plus recommendations. And one of them was actually to create an ambassadorial post for technology and digitalization in recognition that, that will be some of the drivers of change globally, locally, and also in fact of what you just mentioned, that some of the big technology companies are in fact becoming very, very large and potentially also extremely influential over local matters, but also over international matters. So that's the background of it. And we've been up and running now for 12 months with a slightly different mandate than most of our colleagues because we have a global mandate and in fact also a global presence. So I spend most of the time in Silicon Valley, but part of my team is actually sitting in Copenhagen and also in Beijing. And we'll get some sort of presence in Nairobi in Kenya soon. I'm
guessing you're going to get to learn to love some airline lounges as well during this this process.
It's not a CO2 neutral initiative. Let me put it like that.
No. Well, I hope you're neutralizing your flights in some way. I am quite curious about the process, right? So when an ambassador shows up at a capital, he or she will go and present their credentials.
Yeah.
Now, so what happened with you when you turned up in the Bay Area?
Yeah, I didn't bring a letter from Her Majesty the Queen of Denmark, and so I haven't handed over my credentials to Zuckerberg or to Google or to Jack Ma of Alibaba. So in that sense, we are disrupting the traditional understanding of diplomacy. This is an ambassadorial post to an industry, but in fact also to all other countries around the world, because what we're trying to do is actually to get other countries to do something along the lines of what we are, because we want to put technology more firmly in the international agenda. I think it'll be easy to convince you why that is necessary, but the basic assumption on our side is, of course, that technology transcends everything. The distinction between what is local and what is global makes no sense anymore. Some of the platforms have no respect for national borders. I think you mentioned the Facebook hearing in Parliament right now. That's a pretty good example that some of these companies are incredibly influential over local matters. So we haven't handed over any credentials, and we're trying to go native in how we dress and how we behave. But other than that, is actually a very traditional diplomatic posting, a very traditional post for an ambassador.
Right, and what's happened in the other side is that the companies themselves have obviously beefed up their presence in terms of policy and lobbying. I think in Brussels there's just so many lobbyists from the large technology companies, and today in Parliament, Mark Zuckerberg, I think, was unable to book a flight over to London, but they've sent Richard Allen, who's a vice president of Facebook, was previously the president of a sovereign nation, which I think speaks to sort of how much power and influence these large firms have actually now wield.
Yeah. And I think to be fair to them, and I'd be intrigued to get your view on that as well, that they're only now beginning to realize and acknowledging that they are sitting on power bases with enormous influence. And to be fair to them, I know there's a lot of techlash, and we certainly have our own criticism and concerns about how they act and how they behave. In fact, one of the key speaking notes in my portfolio is to say we need them to take societal responsibility at a level which is proportional to the kind of influence they're exercising. But to be fair to them, I think even in the C-suite level, some of them are really struggling with the complexity of what they've become, the power that they have, and how they actually exercise that, both from a commercial point of view and also from a societal point of view. And, I think those are the battlegrounds that we'll see in the coming years. And I think the companies will be judged on their ability to take responsibility and to help protect some of the key values and institutions that some of us think are quite interesting. But Azeem, back to you. What's your sort of sense on where the C-suite is going?
Yeah, on this particular question, we've already started to see points where let's talk about a positive example where these large technology companies are fulfilling the functions that we normally asked our nation state to fulfill for us. One of the basic ones is security. I mean, even libertarians can agree to that a nation state provides security. And when we look at cyber threats, these things now start to cross borders. There was the famous one where there was the attack in the Ukraine. We can probably guess where it originated from, on a local Ukrainian bank. It spread across Microsoft Windows services and brought down the great Danish company of Maersk, the shipping company globally, created some really, really difficult issues for that particular firm. Now, when these sorts of attacks happen, however good your military is, you don't have the capabilities, you don't even have the control of the infrastructure or the patching and software update systems to go in and do the fix. And you're reliant on the one hand, the private companies, but on the other hand, particularly the very, very large technology companies, the Microsofts, the Googles, the Cloudflares, and so on, to step up, notice the alert, stop it, isolate it, and then put out a patch that controls it. That is the sort of thing that 50 or 100 years ago, I as a citizen would have expected my nation state to do. And you talked about these novel responsibilities that these companies have ended up earning as they've got sort of bigger and more successful. This is one of those. And part of the challenge is, when I pay, as I do, €8 a month for Microsoft Office Online, I'm getting that piece of Office software, which Microsoft is now going to protect for me. But I don't have any governance control towards Microsoft. I don't get to vote with that. I don't get a say. They don't really have accountability. So there's a gap there which we need to figure out how to address. And it's not sort of the intentionality of these firms, but by any means, it's where they've ended up. But they have got to figure out now, I think, and we have to figure out with them, how are we going to draw those lines? How are we going to draw that accountability?
Absolutely. And I think one of the other reasons why that is the case is, of course, there's a much more blurred line between what is state actors and what is non-state actors, and how those two actors are actually sort of collaborating or being used by one another. And I think that actually puts cyber wars at a different place compared to how traditional wars or conflicts are being fought out early on. But I think the response to that, at least from our point of view, is that you need to bring in the industry much closer to government. So we need to almost establish a new partnership where we work together, where we both try and fight and also attribute some of these threats and the specific attacks. And this is a very value-driven dimension, because in fact, this is also about protecting democracy. It's about protecting the critical infrastructure of our nations. But you pointed out that one of our companies were extremely hard hit last year with an NotPetya attack. It was sort of the 9/11 moment of cyber attacks in Denmark, and it's one of the reasons why we developed a new national cyber strategy. I think, to be a little bit self-critical, we're becoming better at doing the defensive stuff, the national stuff. I think where we're struggling is to get the international collaboration going. How do we get the normative dimension going? And just to underline your point, of course, we're now seeing Microsoft basically driving discussions on the potential for Digital Geneva Convention. They've come up with the Tech Accord, and I think they have now more than 60 companies that signed up to it. I think that also shows that some of the companies are becoming foreign policy actors, or at least they are trying to influence policies as well. We think we need an ambassador to that, not because we think that the companies are more important than countries, but in acknowledgement that it's a much more blurred picture, and we need actually to reestablish some partnerships that we haven't had before.
We have, of course, had companies act as foreign policy actors in the past. I mean, the East India Company out of Great Britain, and we know how that ended up, and we know the sort of contributions and damages it created, and the use of privateers back in that time, and of course the Dutch Indies Company, and which is one that I guess from your previous posting you must know well. So what I think is quite helpful in this process is that it's useful to have some historical precedent where we can say, how did these things play out last time? What did we do well? What didn't we do well? And how do we now think about this moving forward? I think it's very hard to work out, see a situation where you can unpick the global digital architecture that is being built from global companies and work out how that maps back into the power base and the territorial definitions of a sovereign state. I don't think it's impossible. I mean, we've got examples in the case of, obviously China is a strong example there, but I think even in a more subtle way, what Germany has done for a very long time with respect to particular classes of extreme right-wing speech, and how they've insisted internet companies deal with that for German users, demonstrate that it's possible. My reading of how states have addressed that more broadly, and I can talk more about the UK, is that we bought a little bit too readily into this vision, both of the internet being global and boundaryless, but also that we should just allow the innovation, because if we don't, it'll go somewhere else.
I think one of the aspects which is on top of the agenda right now is, of course, digital taxation. Mm-hmm. And the European Commission had a couple of proposals put forward some time ago. Unfortunately, that didn't find support among EU member states. And nonetheless, if you look at the statistics, digital companies on average pays around half of what the traditional companies pays in the European Union. So those are no small matters. In the case of Denmark, of course, this is the question of whether we can finance our welfare system, our healthcare systems, our educational system, etc. What we're finding is that it's always difficult to find the right model for regulating, including on taxation. But we want to see the industry actually taking part of that responsibility on their shoulders, help us define how could a digital taxation look like, how do we put it together so it doesn't stifle innovation, it doesn't hurt us, it doesn't prevent us from building the new companies of the future. But the question is, how do we bring them into those discussions, and how do we make sure that they also help us define the right way forward?
I think you're much closer to them than I am, given the amount of time you spend with them. So I'll give you a slightly less informed view, which is that I suspect they're very, very far away from being able to think of the benefits of taxation and social goods and public goods. I think there's Milton Friedman, the purpose of a corporation is to make profits. There's the front half of the famous Ronald Reagan quote, government isn't the solution, government is the problem. And there is the libertarian streak that came out of the late 60s and early 70s in Silicon Valley, all of which I think has impacted how those firms think about this particular problem. And so I suspect we need to think about both carrots, the sort of helpful hand, and quite firmly wielded sticks around these companies to help them think about what really is their contribution to the well-being and the purposeful direction of the countries in which they operate. And I'm not sure it's going to be easy. I also am not sure whether the traditional model of thinking about taxation will necessarily work. I mean, I have some ideas that maybe are a little bit radical on that front.
Azeem, can I throw one of your earlier quotes at you, because I think it's quite critical. You said, you correct me if I'm wrong on this one, that one of the largest risks is that we lose faith in the power of technology and its ability to raise the human conditions and improve the state of humans. We need to recognize that innovation is successful for most of us if there is a high degree of trust in the system. Now, I think that's a fantastic quote, and it's very close to my own views on where technology is moving ahead. The problem is, of course, it doesn't require too many Cambridge Analyticas to sort of jeopardize that trust in society or on technology, etc. I come from a country where we have a high degree of trust, both in governments but also in new technologies. But what we've seen with a couple of the scandals of the last 12 months is that it's very easy to tilt that trust and that balance. Right. How does that look from a UK perspective?
Well, I think from the UK standpoint, trust is significantly down in the technology platforms. And it's interesting, actually, in Asia and China, Singapore, trust is up over the last year. In the UK and the US, it's significantly down. The Cambridge Analytica stuff, the way that it connected somehow to the Brexit vote, which has been reasonably fractious in the UK, to say the least, has also had people looking at these this issue of how we share data. And what I noticed not from research, but from talking to people in and around my communities and people who I meet through my work, is that they actually find it quite hard to draw a distinction between, say, the Facebook business model and its use of data, and Google's business model and its use of data, and Apple's business model and its use of data. Three very different companies. Apple barely uses consumer data for its business, and Facebook is dependent on it. And then the fact that you have as a mercurial and divisive character as Elon Musk out there with his great supporters, but also riling people, also doesn't help. So I think we run a significant risk of turning against what I've sort of described as big T technology, which is what makes the headlines in the newspapers. And with that, small t technology, which is about essentially how do we design things that have a human purpose, that help fulfill a human purpose. And one of the methods we've used to do that is the method of science and testing and empirical validation. So it's the risk for me is a spillover from being really cross about Facebook, not being willing to listen to the fact that Apple has a very distinctly different business model, so being cross with them, and then being cross with the whole endeavor that is ultimately connected with this humanistic process of the scientific method and small t technology. And we've started to see measles and chickenpox outbreaks right across sort of Europe and the US as a sort of desire to doubt the process of science or the process of the technocrats. starts to bubble. And I think that's a really important risk for us, because the biggest single challenge that we actually face, much as we maybe cross with the use of our data or whoever's in running our country, is about climate change. And that is going to be solved at some technical level by technologies and research and these new things that we have yet to come up with.
If you sort of argue that one of the reasons why you see the rise of populism across the world, basically, and one of the reasons why we've seen a vote on Brexit coming through is that people feel a little bit left alone outside the systems. They don't feel included. They feel perhaps their voices are not being heard. Can technology be a game changer for bringing people into the equation, or do you think actually that technology might increase or be a catalyst for let's say, having people inside and outside the mainstream?
Yeah, that is such a great question. And that comes down to how we choose to design those technologies and how we choose to apply them, and the intentionality. There is a second great divergence that is going on. The first great divergence happened at after the Industrial Revolution, where the countries who were able to harness the knowledge and the know-how that came out of that got very, very wealthy, and the other countries known as the Global South nowadays didn't. There's the second great divergence, I think, that is now happening, is that technologies are accelerating at a very, very rapid rate, and it's not just a single technology.
Nope.
It's gene editing and gene sequencing, it's lithium-ion batteries, it's the size of satellites. They used to be something that only a nation state could do. And just last week, a reader of my newsletter sent a handful of iPhone-sized satellites into space. And it can be done very cheaply now, but it's, of course, with processing power, accelerating it faster than traditional long-term Moore's law rates. And they're combining. So these exponentials, just to sound like a mathematician for a second, are getting...
Or Silicon Valley.
Oh, right, combinatorial. Yeah. In their power. So they're racing away. Now, the social systems that we have don't move as quickly. They move quicker than they did, in a sense, because we can get ideas across them much faster because of the technology. But ultimately, they're baked in on human behaviors, on how we live our everyday lives, on the pace of a family, the pace of a city, the pace of a village. And so marrying that mismatch that emerges will, I think, create more and more tensions between the sort of technocrats and those who are able to really take advantage of those systems, and the rest. And mismatches in general in politics are not a great thing, right? Yeah, pitchforks and guillotines often come out at that stage. Yeah.
And I agree with you on the risk of fragmentation also because of new technologies, despite the fact that they will be fantastic game changer also for bringing people out of poverty, having better healthcare and education as well.
Down winding streets, beyond the dreaming spires, inside the college walls, debates are happening. Future Makers from the University of Oxford invites you to that debate. Join me, philosopher Peter Millikan, and 3 experts as we discuss the movements that are shaping the future of our society. Our first series is all about artificial intelligence, and we'll be exploring topics from the future automation of jobs to the inherent bias of algorithms and even the impact AI may have on our health. That's Future Makers, available to download now.
I actually recently just came back from a visit to India, my first visit in this job to India. And it was fascinating and very inspirational in many ways to see how technology is being utilized also to connect people in the more rural areas. You probably know this Aadhaar system, which is a social security number system. And to be very frank with you, preparing for the visit, we looked into it, and of course a lot of discussions. Is this the social credit system of India, like we see in China? Was it something different? My take from just spending a few days there is that it from the outset it is something different. It is actually about connecting people, giving them access that they haven't had before. So it could be a democratization process born by technology. You can build upon that many other systems. But I also, frankly speaking, see a lot of potential for an increased digital divide. I think we see that nationally, even in a small place like Denmark, you have more rural areas that are going to be the last places to connect to 5G technology, so you won't have the benefits that you will have in the urban areas as well. And I think we have to pay attention to this, because I think that fragmentation that could come from rolling out these new fantastic technologies that you mentioned, we have to make sure that that is not unevenly distributed, that they don't see sort of a digital poorness or poverty coming out of it, because I think the politics of that could be dangerous, both locally but also internationally. And again, I represent a foreign ministry, so of course we're also looking at that at a global level. What will happen in Africa, what will happen in Asia. And perhaps just to throw another question at you, Azeem, we talked a little bit about the fragmentation, but if we bring in the future of the labor market, automation, I'm spending a lot of time reading what much more smart people than myself are thinking about it. And what I see is that there is no mainstream view on, are we going to see sort of a equilibrium, state of play with the number of jobs that we have? Are we going to see them increase or being reduced? On a personal level, and I don't speak on behalf of the Danish government on that, I have a sense that it might be difficult for us to maintain the same number of jobs because of AI, because of automation, looking a little bit ahead. So the perspective, sort of a new feudal system almost, where very few have everything and the rest of us need to find something else to do, is certainly out there. What's your view on the future of the labor market?
Well, you said the new feudal system. There's a great short story by the Chinese science fiction writer Liu Cixin, and which is called The Last Capitalist. In this story, essentially, they have a contractarian society, and it's one where everything is managed by sort of contracts and obligations. And so somebody does a little bit better one generation, or a group does, and they have a little bit more than the rest, and the rest becomes serfs. At the next generation, the group with the power gets smaller but more powerful and more serfs, until at the very, very final iteration, there's one person with all the power, and everyone else is living on the feudal land. Now, I think what he identified in that particular short story was this idea that there is a risk of heading in that direction, and we have the indicators when we think about how does value get shared across a network like Uber. The drivers get very little compared to the shareholders, and relative to the, for sake of argument, hours worked by the top executives and the founders. When I look at the automation question, like you, I'm a bit confused about what I read. Yeah. There's a few things that I am sort of fairly certain on. Number one, it's going to vary from country to country, depending on the industrial structure, their current level of roboticization, the relative cost of labor and the complexity of what they're doing.
Skills and competences.
Demographics.
Yep.
What we're seeing is, for example, in a number of countries like the US or the UK, there's very, very high levels of employment right now. So arguably you could absorb more robots and wouldn't make that much difference. The second thing that I'm reasonably certain of is that this technology will be able to be deployed both in sort of white collar environments where people are often in very routinized jobs, and in non-white collar environments much more quickly than previous types of technology, because we've spent the last 30 years defining processes very cleanly, digitizing our businesses. These things are ready to be plugged in and plugged out. That does then lend itself to a situation where there will be a lot of change for many, many people. Even if in aggregate we create more jobs, many tens of millions, potentially hundreds of millions of people will have their jobs change around them, possibly not by choice. And we have to be very clear that level of change being forced onto people by forces greater than themselves can create a sort of sense of helplessness and frustration and sort of negative psychological impact. So I'm reasonably certain that is the case, and we have to think about what sort of policies and systems we need to build in order to manage that in a sort of human way that looks after people's well-being and the well-beings of our society in a sustainable fashion. So I'm quite far away from there will be no jobs. Mm-hmm. I think that it's possible to imagine a future where people don't feel unemployed and still are able to maintain a good quality of life, because I think lots of new classes of jobs will emerge, as have emerged in generations previously.
But if that is the case, and I'm not hearing you say that you're convinced it'll be a zero-sum game, that might be some job losses along the way.
Yeah.
But that requires that we hit the Control-Alt-Delete button inside our mindsets, because it's a different kind of identity that most of us will have to get used to, where the jobs are no longer everything we identify with. It's a different kind of future. But I assume if you look at it from a political economy point of view, it also requires all governments, all decision makers to take a much more strategic view on it. And if I go back to my previous posting in Indonesia and Jakarta, that's a country that hoped to benefit tremendously from the raise of labor costs in China. They hope to attract a lot of the jobs in the heavy industries, in car industries, etc. The problem is, of course, that those are probably the jobs that are going to disappear first. In other words, the prognosis of their economy might be very difficult to see actually in reality, because of the changes to the labor market. So it requires a strategic approach from countries, and it requires a degree of preparedness that is not necessarily the case if you look globally at it. How do we help prepare decision makers for this future, despite the fact that it's extremely difficult to predict whether it'll be positive, negative, or status quo?
You've really thrown a super tough question at me. I
have many more on my paper.
That's great.
That's why we're here to get all the silver bullets out of you today.
Yeah, well, I know, absolutely. So we used to have a roadmap for the emerging economies, which was you can very quickly go out and build your industrial capacity and your infrastructure, and because of your labor costs, you would be able to sort of take business and compete in different ways. And that model seems to have weakened a little bit because of approaches towards tariffs and so on, and now roboticization. One thing that I would say about roboticization is there are very few industrial robots on the planet right now. And that they can't do that much, and we're a while away from them really being capable and cost effective to replace human work. I think from a state perspective, what you clearly need to do is be engaged in the discussion with the entrepreneurs in your own country. You need to be learning about what an entrepreneurial ecosystem starts to look like. You need to use your power as a state to convene people. You may not be able to do much more than say, let's use the presidential palace for a meeting. It's an incredibly motivating force. I mean, in the UK, for the last several years, technology entrepreneurs have been wandering in and out of number 10 Downing Street for almost any reason, because it's really cool to go there.
We met at the Lisbon Web Summit a few weeks ago, and you just put out your podcast with Reid Hoffman, and we were talking a little bit about this Blitzscaling.
Right.
And I was cheeky enough to say that I thought it was a fantastic podcast, and you really had an interesting discussion. But I had hoped that you would have been a little bit tougher on the question of whether Blitzscaling is good not only for the individual company, but also from a societal point of view, from an overall point of view. And it reminded me, actually, I took this week course at Stanford this summer to put something on my CV so I can claim that I have technology insights, which I didn't have before. But the professors during that week continuously talked about how do you make sure you innovate inside your company, how to make sure you fight competition, you make sure you remain at top of your game. And at the end of the week, I sort of were left with this question, are we sure that's what's good for society, is that you retain old companies just for the sake of retaining old companies, that there isn't a sort of a natural balance where new innovation comes and old companies die away? And I think it's a little bit the same question that I had with your podcast. Innovation is fantastic. We have a lot to learn from innovation, especially when you come from a government. But sometimes innovation environments and epicenters perhaps also need to take a broader look on what's good for societies and how to make sure that it fits into the values that we fought for literally hundreds of years to create. How do you see that discussion taking place inside the technology companies or the innovation centers?
Just a reminder, this podcast is supported by Spotify. They've contributed to making music more accessible in the past decade, and I'm excited about their new feature, which brings podcasts closer to listeners all around the world. So find Spotify today and subscribe to the EV podcast there. Now, back to our conversation. We should look at where we are with innovation. So two little historical observations, innovation and the idea of protecting innovation and using it as an advantage really came, I mean, obviously there'd been secrets, the secret of my civilization, but the Venetian glass blowers were the first ones to really get patents because what they did was very hard and it was sought after and they wanted it protected. And then in England, we had Patents Royal and the Statute of Anne, which started to introduce copyright at a point where not many people were innovating. And it was a little bit of a rarity. And so you get to a point today where lots of people innovate. It's actually systematized. We have spontaneous ideation that happens in companies all over the world. And so the question is, do we have a dearth of innovation that now needs to have this government state-enforced monopoly called the patent over the top, or is it just an everyday thing? When I look back to the development of the English economy and then the British economy around the Industrial Revolution, one of the things that you see is that we were not as aggressive in protecting intellectual property. And so the softness of IPR protections allowed a leakage and a sharing of ideas that is quite closely tied to one of the reasons why Britain did so very well in the late 17th and early 18th century and then the 19th century. So when we look at this question of innovation, there's an assumption that more is always better, that faster is always better, that if we don't treat you really well, you won't otherwise do it. And so there's a risk that we won't get any. And I think you only have to walk into any kitchen in any part of the world and see some innovation, whether it's the way in which the dishcloth is handled near the stove to dry it or the way in which the knife is held. I mean, innovation is a very, very natural tool. It's a tool that people enjoy. It's of self-serving interest to create it as a thing in itself that then needs protection and reward in this particular way. From a historical perspective, I think the open source movement is extremely powerful in reminding us that there are other reasons why people innovate, and innovation can come from that. And we're starting to see open source movements emerge and build. They're building a new type of commons that is a digital commons, and the digital commons becomes a shared resource that we can all benefit from if it's stewarded properly. Now, that is one way of saying that while the lawyers will fight to protect the intellectual property, while the venture capitalists will demand superior returns from sort of brilliant young minds, we are going to benefit from having a much wider, softer view of what innovation is and how it should emerge. And I suspect that the pendulum will swing towards a more collectivist approach. Now, I've got no evidence. I can't, but I will say I think we'll look back in a few years and say actually that pendulum has swung, and we are sharing, we are thinking in terms of commons much more than we perhaps did in the late 90s.
So this will be a parenthesis in history, in other words.
Well, I think it'll just be a moment where things were. You used the word equilibrium earlier, right? They got out of balance. They'll re-equilibrate. Yeah. It'll probably swing the other way. We'll find that we actually do have to tighten various laws in 25 or 30 years' time. But that said, it's not all about the software companies. I mean, just this week we read that the first CRISPR-edited twins were born in China, and so there are also cases where we need to think about how should we control and maintain rules around particular technologies. And I think that's, in a sense, at the heart of this the discussion, which is this process is so powerful that if it goes on in an unguided way, the outcomes are very, very hard to predict. And who could have predicted that the application of Black-Scholes option theory that resulted in securitization of all sorts of financial instruments would have turned into a bubble and a burst in the global financial crisis that created the schisms and the fractures that you alluded to a few minutes ago.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's only in Denmark that this happens, but when we have visitors coming into Silicon Valley, most of them are saying, how can we replicate Silicon Valley in Denmark or in Europe? I'd be interested in having your views on two separate questions. One is, where do you see the big innovation centers or epicenters turning up in the world? One of the reasons I'm asking this question is what I've noticed just in 12 months in Silicon Valley is that innovation sometimes happens through mergers and acquisitions. The big companies are becoming so big that they basically buy themselves into new innovations. They scoop up everything that is happening in Europe, and you see more and more people roaming the streets of Palo Alto or Mountain View or Menlo Park. So the question is this sort of almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that Silicon Valley has become so powerful that we haven't seen the last of Silicon Valley? In fact, they have the potential to continue to be a very important hub simply because of the volume and the potential to buy up new innovations around the world. And the second one is, of course, when you look at Europe, things are happening in Scandinavia at a smaller scale. I think Paris is certainly one of the bigger innovation centers, and of course, London.
You've gone to China a number of times. So what do you see and observe and feel when you get out of the airports in Beijing or Shanghai?
Or Shenzhen.
Yeah.
Well, I think what I see and what I feel is, of course, that massive change is on the way because of new technologies and the data application in it. But on the global scale, there's no doubt in my mind that we are seeing a shift from the west towards the east, and that China is becoming, if not one of the most important, perhaps the most important center of innovation and the application of new technologies. And it goes without saying that machine learning and artificial intelligence is probably the new technology where China has so many obvious advantages with the accessibility to data that is not necessarily GDPR protected as we know it in Europe. And that just helps build those machines and get those machines to perform at a pace which is going to be difficult for us in Europe or even in the US to keep pace with. So I think we need to pay attention to China, and it's impossible not to be fascinated or impressed with what is happening and the scale of innovation. And again, as I said before, the applicability of technologies in China, it's mind-blowing in many ways. But of course, there's a flip side of the coin, which is, is that necessarily the way forward that we think is the right way? I think in some ways it is, but in other areas, there are values, there are fundamental rights, there is, overall societal approach to technologies, which I think is questionable. And, the deduction for me in all of that is that we might be critical on what some of the big technology companies of the US is doing these days, and rightly so, I have to say, and also having dealt with them for more than 12 months, it's not always been a sweet ride with a lot of nice talks. It's been difficult and very tough from time to time. And on the other hand, you see a lot of sort of Europlash happening in the US. They don't particularly enjoy GDPR. They think that we overregulate, etc. But at the end of the day, we're part of the same heritage. We adhere to some of the same values. And I think we have to pay attention to that, not least here in the end of 2018, approaching 2019, because I think the big battle will be the overall approach to technologies. And being better at building the next generation of AI machines might be impressive and fantastic also from an economic point of view, but it's not necessarily the right way forward. And I think we have to be aware of that both at national level, but also internationally. Because I think one thing that I use all the time is, where did venture capital investments in AI go last year, 2017? And it was probably the first year where we saw that the majority actually went into China. 48% of all global venture capital in AI systems went to China, 38% to the US, and 14% for the rest of the world. That includes Europe, by the way. I think that's a very concrete example of the changing contours of at the global level of where technology is heading.
China has got a bunch of advantages that you discussed and described, and I think the state private sector fusion as well that also emerges is another part. It was almost inevitable in a sense, because historically China has been a much larger part of the global GDP. It was just that last couple of 100 years where we had the divergence where this changed. So we had to be prepared for it. Outside of the three Chinese cities you described, I think we are seeing more ecosystems emerge. They take a long time to emerge. And one of the difficulties is that as soon as you get something promising, there's lots of reasons why an Apple or a Samsung or another American firm will come in and acquire them. And so in the UK, we have in Cambridge almost a revolving cycle of companies being built and then bought by particularly Apple, but also some of the other Microsofts and so on. And then their executives leaving and starting another one. And I think there's a challenge there about, are you really now just low-cost nourishing innovation for another country? But innovation happens in cities rather than in countries. I think that's really important. And that helps us think about the Brexit question, because the innovation economy in the UK is really driven by a couple of hubs. It's mostly in the sort of London triangle. And if you think about Silicon Valley, the distance from, the Marin Headland all the way down to San Jose is far bigger than the triangle that is London, Oxford, Cambridge. So you could sort of, in a sense,
with traffic, it's about the same, though, no?
Yeah, with traffic, it's about the same. And so if you look at that hub, you'll see that cities, that's a city scale ecosystem, which is almost independent of what happens nationally. And cities are incredibly resilient things. I mean, they survive everything. They survive earthquakes. They survive nuclear weapons, in the case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they often survive longer than nation states do. So there are reasons to believe that the things that in general have made London attractive to be in, which is not the house prices, and it's not the dirt and the level of crime, it's the intermixing, the conversations, the dynamism will continue to be attractive even in most Brexit scenarios. I mean, if we can't get flights in and there's no clean water, there's no medicine or food, London will look sort of relatively less attractive, I'm sure. And as the centre starts to shift away from the Bay Area, London's actually in quite a nice spot. I mean, if you want to go from San Francisco to Beijing, why not? But the same dynamic that makes London attractive also means that Silicon Valley will maintain its attractiveness because there are lots of smart people thinking in different ways. That said, the monoculture in Silicon Valley that exists might be enough to frustrate people. And one could imagine that monoculture getting too extreme. And so naturally have people saying, you know what, I'd rather be closer to my mum and dad and do this. And you know what, Berlin is pretty vibrant or Lisbon is pretty vibrant. I think this will be okay. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And in particular is, I don't think Silicon Valley in of itself has a way of being purpose-driven the way that the mayor of London or the mayor of LA or the mayor of Copenhagen could be purpose-driven in trying to shape the city in a particular way.
When you look at technology here in 2018, what makes you concerned about the next couple of years, and what makes you optimistic about the next couple of years?
Well, I'm quite concerned with the risks of a techlash hurting our ability to accept novel AI diagnostics or MRI machines. That's definitely something that we need to think about. 2 years for me, though, in general, is too short a time. It's the time frame of unexpected shocks, like a cyber attack or a disinformation campaign. I think longer term, I'm concerned in this order with our ability to satisfactorily deal with climate change, and then secondarily, our ability to increase the amount of trust and mutual respect within our societies, the flip side of which is the growing inequality. That level of trust and mutual respect is a critical part to us being able to get together and solve problems collectively and not split and splinter. And I think technologies can play a very strong part in that, as they have historically. Yeah. And how about you, as you look out over the next 2 years or longer? What are you optimistic about in technology, and what are you nervous about?
Well, I think if sort of divided in the short term, medium term, and long term, I think short term, personally, I'm concerned about the cyber attacks that we're seeing, and of course the role of Russia and the non-state actors and the damage they can do from a purely destructive point of view. I think luckily we haven't seen any catastrophic incidents coming out of cyber attacks. It's been extremely damaging for companies. I was ambassador to Indonesia when the NotPetya attack happened last year, and we had to help. Maersk Line, they had no idea what was inside the containers. We had to get special permissions for them to unload, etc. So very damaging. But we haven't seen, I think, something very dramatic. We haven't had a Titanic moment, basically, on cyber attacks.
Like a plane falling out of the sky or something.
Something like that, or the national health system basically crashing, operations going bad. So I think short term, that's something that we need to really pay attention to and fix and really work together also internationally about. Medium term, I think the role of the big technology companies, I'm not talking only about the Americans here, but globally, I think they have to get it right. And I think that requires a change of mindset in the C-suite, where it's not only about being a good programmer or a good coder, it's not only about being a good engineer, it's also about making sure that those companies adhere to the higher standards, not only in how they promote their commercial activities, but also how they play into societies and into the international systems. And I'm concerned, again, on a personal level, on the impact of some of these new technologies in the companies, on global governance, on the institutions that we have developed over the last couple of centuries. So I think medium term, it's going to be incredibly important that we see responsible leadership turning up in all the big companies. I think we're seeing that in a number of them. We're seeing, the jury's still out on a couple, and then there are a couple of them that, frankly speaking, are acting in a way which is problematic. In my view, also extremely problematic from a commercial point of view further down the line. I think we'll see a convergence between the public view on the companies and the government's view on the companies. And at the end of the day, that will jeopardize their activities and the potential for delivering to their stock owners, etc. Long term, I've already alluded to that. I think there is a basic question on where the world is heading and what systems will prevail, what values will prevail. We are seeing the shift from the west to the east. It's, as I said before, very easy to be fascinated by it, but I think it also raises some fundamental issues about what kind of world we're building, who will define the directions and the trajectories of that world. And I think there will be some real discussions on the values and, again, the institutional setup on that. So what I'm trying to say is long term, there is a question of East versus the West. And then, of course, how do we make sure I think you referred to the global South or the developing economies, that they don't trail far behind, that they also get the benefits and reap the benefits of new technologies, IoT systems, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of my concern list. But I had to sort of add to that list that we should never forget that technologies, and I live and see it on a daily basis, that the potential of the new technologies is incredible. You go to a company, they do retina scanning, they'll be able to diagnose you with diabetes, give you better treatment than we've ever seen before, long distance surgical procedures, better education to people that are in rural areas. It's going to be a game changer in so many positive ways, and we should never forget to focus on those potentials. But I think realism is not a bad thing, not least when you're a diplomat. So never forgetting to also focus on the concerns or the challenging areas is something that we'll continue to advocate.
Yeah, I'm curious about this idea of the center of gravity moving towards the east.
Yes.
And we tend to focus on the rising power, who's getting more power. But I think there are also risks that emerge when you ask the question, and who has power now and is losing it?
Yes.
And when we look at that picture, I think we can see that, post the collapse of the Soviet Union, there is still some ramifications. There's an angry bear in a sense, and it's not just at a national level. It'll be at a company level. I think some of the reasons that we see such aggression and stonewalling from Facebook is a sense that people are trying to diminish its power.
Yeah.
And it may even happen within societies, because at some point, if we're going to equalize and redistribute, that has to come from someone's take. Even when the pie is growing, it needs to come from someone's take. So when you think about this overall shift in technology, how do you think we should think about the nations or the companies that have power now who need to adjust the way that they operate?
I'll be a little bit selfish in reply to this question, because I think what we're trying to do, and again, we're a very small country, we won't be able to fix it. We need to bandwagon with a lot of other countries to get this right. But I think what we're trying to do at a small scale is to raise the stakes vis-a-vis the companies. And, one of the criticisms that I absolutely despises that comes in our direction is that we're now sugarcoating the big technology companies. We're helping them. We're basically there to make nice to the companies. And, my reply to that is always, I wish you could sit into some of the conversation I'm having. Now, that's the nature of diplomacy. That doesn't work. Right. But people would realize that these are not necessarily pleasant discussions, and we're bringing real topics to the headquarters in Silicon Valley or in Guangzhou or in Frankfurt or elsewhere. Right. And just to give you a couple of examples of what it is that we're discussing, this is about police investigators' access to information on real investigations. It's about how to avoid meddling with election processes, being at the national level or the European level. It's about making sure that, when 42,000 Danes had their data breached at the Cambridge Analytica scandal, what are they doing about that? How is that data being treated? Those are not small issues. Right. Those, in my view, are fundamental issues. They're very big issues. They have an impact on you and me, but they also have an impact on the international system and where the world is basically heading. So I think raising the stakes and making sure that you almost sort of have a pit bull function in making sure that if the companies make the wrong choices and go down the wrong way, then we're here to point that out. We're here to bring views from the Danish government, in our case, to the headquarters and say, well, that's not exactly how we think you should play ball. On the other hand, we love the sharing economy. We love the platform. So let's actually, reinvent the relationship between the private sector and the public sector. Let's work together. Let us help, you define your own policy so that you don't continuously get in trouble because of a mismatch between policies and practice. So I think it's a realistic approach, but it's also sort of a process where there is a value proposition also to the big companies. We're not there to jeopardize their commercial opportunities or to bring the big regulatory stake. In fact, we're there to recognize that governments always have difficulties getting it right on the regulatory front, and we need each other in this conversation. What I would hope is that the leadership of some of the big technology companies will also increasingly see the benefit and added value of working together with governments. And I think we're not quite there yet.
You're not, but what you are doing is building a new set of institutional relationships, a class that didn't exist previously. And I think with every iteration of technologies, you get new forms of relationships or political institutions or modes of governance that emerge. I mean, democracy wouldn't have made sense 700 or 800 years ago. People were not well enough educated. We didn't have the communication systems and so on. So as you look out the next 10 or 20 years and look at the existing political institutions we have and sets of relationships, whether they're multilateral or not, and tools for governance, which of those do you think can survive as they are? Which can survive with changes? What won't survive, and what new things could emerge to take their place?
So this is the easy question towards the end.
Sorry about that.
No, okay. This is payback for some of the questions I asked you. Well, I think if I begin with some of the concerns, I don't know the numbers for the UK, but I think on a European level, what is quite disturbing is that when you ask the younger generation, the millennials, about how important is democracy, how important is the government structures, etc., that's actually declining on average. Mm-hmm. So for those of us who grew up in the Cold War and still remember, right. When I did my military service, all the exercise plans was always, the Warsaw Pact is now invading Denmark, and how do we respond to that?
Я говорю по-русски, because at similar age to you, Russian was a course offered at school because it might be useful.
Absolutely.
In case of emergency.
And I'm going to sound very old now, but I think, that history legacy, or having lived through the 70s or 80s and having experienced the fall of the Berlin Wall, is not necessarily the case for my children. And I see that on a daily basis. So I think we're going to have a big struggle, and a very important struggle, to make sure that we continue to explain why democracy is the best way forward, why we have to protect the institutions, and why the private sector is part of that equation and also have a common responsibility in that sense. I think governance is changing and will change. And I think that will require a number of years before we get our systems in place. Agile governance, whatever you want to call it, is of course.
Denmark's doing some fascinating work on agile governance. I think I actually read a blog post on one of the government pages about this. Yeah,
fantastic.
Which I will tell people: Google agile governance in Denmark, and 5 criteria for it, and so on. It's very interesting.
But we were trying, and we of course love to brag about the fact that we're number one on this DESI European index on digitalization and on the UN side as well. But I think if you ask our political decision makers back home, we acknowledge that even for a hyper-digitalized country like Denmark, we're going to be challenged in the fourth industrial revolution, future of the labor market, how we govern, how institutions will be. So I think we're standing in front of a very fascinating decade where new technologies might change everything. But I think we're also standing in front of a decade where we will have to take some very conscious discussions on how we protect the institutions that we think are important. And I think that applies locally, it applies regionally in Europe, but it certainly also applies on a global scale, which is one of the reasons why I think you probably know the UN Secretary General set down this high-level panel on digital cooperation. I think that's important no matter what comes out of it, because it's about acknowledging that technology is going to transcend everything we do, including for the UN, and getting some thoughts into how we get it right. So I think I'm optimistic, positive, but I'm also realistic in the sense that I think we're standing in front of some pretty important pieces of decisions.
I very rarely feel jealous about the work that somebody else is doing. I feel very lucky in what I get to do, but I think you have a really fascinating brief, and I'm hoping that other foreign ministries will see the benefit of having ambassadors who are working with these supranational technology companies. It's been fantastic to chat to you today. Really enjoyed it. We're going to have to do it again. And of course, I should really have brought you some Ferrero Rocher, which is what all ambassadors deserve when they come to London.
Of course. Yeah. Azeem, it's been a pleasure. I've been a big fan of your podcast and the Exponential View for a long time. So having the opportunity to discuss some of these big issues with you is always a pleasure. So let's continue those discussions. I'm not sure we'll find the silver bullet in the next couple of months. It'll probably be there next year as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Hey, it's Azeem here. I'll be back next week with another great conversation. And remember, it really helps us reach new audiences and continue to improve the quality of debate around technology if more people are listening. So please take a moment to share this and recommend it to your friends. Thank you.